So when you're talking that through, I'll have.
What?
So my next slide is just of the presentation.
Okay,
Of,
we'll
of
go.
the
Let's
schedule.
take it.
Same thing
Okay.
you have right there.
Okay.
Pretty much. Okay.
Okay. Let me get Dan. Is this microphone on? Where's the microphone? I don't hear myself.
Yeah, we asked them about it too.
Is the microphone on? It's up here. Y'all can hear us? Oh,
Oh,
okay.
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 Okay. So,
Dan? Ooh,
so
let me
give
get
an
him.
overview of the whole thing.
Girl, you can give.
You want?
Everyone, our satellite time gives me 4:00 p.m. and we're welcoming you here to our, we believe, eighth annual College of Education Research and Creative Week, part of the campus-wide College of Education, campus-wide Research and Creative Week. I am Rhea Miles, co-chair of this committee, of the Research Committee, along with,
Ann Tickner, also co-chair.
all right, and she's going to tell you a little bit more.
Yeah, so just on your program, you have a schedule of events, and this is all of the presenters. So we'll begin with Dan first, and he will be our first faculty invited lecturer. And then we'll have Matt, who will be second after a question and answer. And then what we will have is we will have 5 roundtables. So faculty will be at different roundtable presentations, sharing their work in a roundtable, and then we'll have students sharing their poster presentations. And those will happen simultaneously, so you'll be able to mix and mingle. We have lots of food back there too, so please do eat up.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so you're gonna introduce Dan?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I'll just,
Go back there.
I will.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
All right, so my next task is to introduce you to our first speaker, our invited lecturer, who is Daniel Dickerson. He has a PhD and is an associate professor of the marvelous, magnificent Department of Mathematics, Science, and Structural Technology Education, which I am a member, that's why I said that. And he is a member of the STEM Corps, that's Collaborative for Research and Education. This is our first year at East Carolina University having the STEM Corps, and this is his first year here at East Carolina University. We like to think we stole him away from Old Dominion University. Their loss, our gain. And his research focuses on the teaching and learning of earth and environmental science content, environmental education, and STEM instruction. He is a former high school earth science teacher who has served as PI, co-PI, or evaluator on NOAA, NSF, U.S. Department of Education, IMLS, state and foundation-funded projects. He's currently mourning the loss of the Carolina Tar Heels to the Villanova Wildcats. Without further ado, I present you Daniel Dickerson. He'll share the name of his title of his project. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Yes, so sorry about that. That is currently my favorite child. I have 4, and to try to keep them in line, I mix it up, and let them know which one's the favorite this week or day, depending on how things go. Let's see if I can get this presentation back up. So, there we go. Okay. And yeah, as Dr. Miles said, the Carolina game, it was harsh. Is anybody else feeling the pain of that? No. No questions from you. No questions from you. Okay, that's all right. That's all right. So yeah, the title of the presentation is The Examination of a Pull-Out STEM Program for Urban Upper Elementary Students. And this is a study that's been published in RISE, the Research in Science Education. If you're interested in it later, we can talk more, and if you can find it helpful in any of the work you're doing. So there are several areas of the literature that are important. And when we talk about STEM, we're talking about science, technology, engineering, mathematics. So you'll see that acronym a lot. And basically, everybody and their brother is trying to develop a STEM program right now. And what those do is they typically are designed to enhance either attitudes, interests, or content understandings, or one or more of those things. And STEM, like I said, the acronym stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics, but when you operationalize that in terms of education and what the curricula look like, it's all over the map. So, a lot of researchers have asked, is there any consensus here? And a lot are trying to be consensus builders in terms of their research agenda. So right now, there is some consensus, but it really circles around the aims and strategies only at this time. So, if you look for what constitutes STEM best practice strategies in the literature, you're really most likely going to be pushed back to what constitute best practices in those individual domains of science, technology, education, engineering education, mathematics education. So for example, with science, inquiry-based education has been sort of the reform-based push for the last 40 years, and that's, if you look at what constitutes best practice in STEM education, we're still there, inquiry-based types of instructional strategies. We also know that students begin forming attitudes and interests about careers and career opportunities, whether they're STEM related or not, about middle school or earlier. I would argue earlier, sometimes much earlier. But that provides a context for when a lot of these programs are implemented in terms of PK through grade education. You also look at membership in underrepresented groups. So another big push in STEM education is around enhancing and increasing the representation of underrepresented populations. And the way NSF defines that includes your usual suspects in terms of race and gender, but also socioeconomics. So they try to take a holistic picture, and what researchers have identified is that there's a complex set of interactions that take place when a person is a member of multiple groups, which oftentimes they are. So if you're a black female who happens to be poor, well, you hit multiple groups. And so those interactions become a little more sophisticated in terms of what's going down. The conventional wisdom regarding STEM education is that if you I notice we have a lot of literacy posters up in here. If you're teaching science, if you're spending time teaching science or mathematics, although it's typically couched in terms of teaching science and social studies, then you're taking away from time that could be spent teaching literacy or mathematics. And so the conventional wisdom has been, if you teach those subjects at any kind of, beyond any kind of superficial level, you're going to see decreases in your literacy and math scores. And usually it centers around literacy. That gets compounded, that sort of perception gets compounded when you introduce things that are considered best practice instructional strategies in STEM, like inquiry-based instruction, which typically tends to be a more time-intensive type of instructional practice rather than a more didactic style like this, where you just talk to the kids and you can burn through content super fast, sort of regardless of conceptual understanding, but you can cover a lot of material rather than addressing it. So the context, so those were the areas of literature that sort of informed the study. The context is this STAR-based program. Is originally, there's a website there that you can click on from your seat, I guess, or not. But anyway, at some point I could give you that link if you're interested in it. But basically what it is a program for 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. And it's a pull-out program. So all these elementary kids and 6th graders are at their regular school, and then they get, for 1 week, they get bused over to a different school. So taken out of their home school, bused to a different school where all they do all day at that school is STEM stuff. And it happens for a week. And so you can start to already see some of the issues that might be cropping up here, right? Particularly with what we just talked about, with principals maybe saying, well, that's a week they could be getting, intensive literacy instruction, and those kinds of challenges. And this is in an extremely poor school system in Virginia. It's about roughly 91% African American school system, high poverty. And part of what they do with this program is try to create a safe climate for learning. They give them a T-shirt. They actually give them a different name, a call sign kind of thing. There's a lot of military presence in the school system, and so a lot of the kids are familiar with call signs and those types of things. So there's a lot of being military connected population. They can identify with a lot of these things, and it's a new environment. And then the curriculum tries to employ hands-on or best practice types of learning, inquiry-based instruction regarding SOL. That's the equivalent of the EOC, EOG, standard course of study stuff. In Virginia, they just call them SOLs, which is great. Yeah, you got it now, right? Yeah. So the subjects that they teach, go into these other soft skills, teamwork, those sorts of things. There are personal projects that the kids do. All the STAR-based instructors have advanced degrees. They bus every kid that's in 4th, 5th, and 6th, so it does not matter what the IEP says, the kid comes. And so you got them all. And that equates to about 3,600 students a year. They also run a summer program for about 400 kids. The cost, this is actually an example of a public-private partnership, but not the kind that you hear about sometimes in North Carolina, apparently. This one doesn't supplant or take away public funding at all. It's simply an add-to piece. So what they're doing is the public schools end up making partnerships with corporations to supplement the school system's budgets. And so they're able to run this program in addition to the regular school system activities at a cost of about $200K per year annual, and they've done it for, I guess they're now in 12th year, something like that, 12th, 13th year. And that was after they got off of funding from DOD. So this was originally a Department of Defense funded program, and was the only one that made a transition from a publicly funded program entirely to a public-private partnership. They've won several awards as a result, and they've got this nonprofit set up because that's the mechanism by which they are able to run this bad boy. And then the school system has been very supportive. So out of this, we worked with them to try and look at the program and provide them some empirical evidence to support or just to find out whether or not what the efficacy level of the program was. And from that, we actually had a couple of research questions. In the purpose of this part of it, this particular study, is to find out whether or not that pull-out program for those students lowers achievement in other subjects. That would be their reading, writing, their mathematics and social studies, and whether or not it impacts their interest and attitudes regarding STEM. And that results in these two research questions. In the full paper, these are actually expanded to additional research sub-questions that we address through a variety of instruments. So what we had for this study was we had a little over 2,200 students, 90% underrepresented populations. We had 75 interviews that we did. We used an embedded within site single case design through Yin, and incorporated mixed methods. So for research question 1, we used descriptive statistics. We also used a separate, because we have multiple, separate 2x11 repeated measure analysis of variance, where we used ethnicity and socioeconomic status as covariates. In addition to that, we also used a box test of equality of variance. We had ran some other stuff for variance. We also ran Bonferroni to make sure that we were using conservative type tests to look at this stuff, because we didn't want any pushback on, oh yeah, alpha was way too high or anything like that. So it was pretty conservative measures. For research question 2, we used descriptives, ANOVAs, and chi-square. We also used domain analysis for some of the qualitative work. The results and conclusions, so we did a lot with this. There were a lot of different charts and graphs and those sorts of things, but at the end of the day, what we had was the STAR-based school standardized test scores showed trends that generally increased over the last 10 years. So basically what we did was we said, all right, well, what's going on before STAR-based was implemented in this implementation school district? And then we picked comparable school districts around, and we said, what's going on in those? What do the scores look like in these different subject areas? The reading, writing, the math, the social studies, the science, before and after implementation of program. And then we ran the numbers and just looked at the trends and that sort of stuff. And so in general, what happened was it went up. So you have this number, right? It's going to look great in the picture. It looks like I'm hitting somebody. So it goes up, right? It's not like that. If it was like that, there'd be a much bigger audience right now. but it so it does this number, But in general, it went up, and it went up everywhere. So when adjusted for the ethnicity and socioeconomic status, because of Hampton Roads and the real strong disparities that you have in wealth across those school districts. For example, Virginia Beach Public Schools is a much wealthier school system than Portsmouth Public School. You found out that there weren't statistically the SOL scores, the end of grade test scores for those school systems in those subjects didn't vary. And so once adjusted for the ethnicity and socioeconomic status. So basically everybody's sort of moving up together, which is great news for science education and education world in general, because everybody's telling us we suck. But here apparently the data say otherwise. That the kids are doing better on these tests, and it's consistent. They're consistently moving up when you look at it over time. And it said that Portsmouth Public Schools was not any different in that regard from the other ones. One of the other things that came out, though, was that the black-white achievement gap was substantially closed over the last decade within STAR-based. The STAR-based implementation site, which means Portsmouth Public Schools. Now, understand, we're not making any causal claims here, but we're simply saying that happened there. Which is to say that having that pull-out program and these kids going and spending all this time doing this purely STEM kind of focused stuff over this week, which we can talk about that, because it's when you do integrated STEM instruction, it's not purely STEM, right? You're including things like arts and literacy and all these other things, and shoot, mathematics is even in the acronym, right? So we got all this stuff going on, and what it showed was that you take these kids out, you put them in here, it's not going to kill your literacy scores. It's okay. Calm down, principals. It's not going to kill your literacy scores. These kids can do it. They can go out there. They can get energized. They can get excited about school. They can get excited about STEM careers. And you don't have to worry about your teachers losing their jobs, or the state coming in and taking over your school system or your school. So then we looked at attitudes towards STEM fields. We had a semantic differential scale, which, if you've ever used those, they're crazy exciting instruments that have and anyway, apparently not. Nobody laughed. So, check those out. They're fun. And then we had another instrument. All of these had solid psychometrics on them. They were developed with NSF funded projects and that sort of thing. And they were in general positive. Typically what happened was they actually had a ceiling effect on most of them, you know. Everybody loves STEM, right? And that was consistent with the literature, and there weren't really any changes. Again, you know, ceiling effect kind of thing. So there weren't really any changes, and plus, I mean, it's 1 week, right? So I mean, how much you know, would we expect to see anyhow? And we told them that up front, but whatever. And so we've got this, we got not much change in these scores. The least positive responses tended to do with expectations for college careers in science and engineering. And we also had some naive understandings of technology that popped up in some of these instruments, which was kind of a sidebar thing, but it was interesting. So basically in that, it supported what you find in the literature about kids in general, regardless of demographic, think STEM is kind of cool. They're interested in it. And they're interested in it for a couple of reasons. One is, you know, you can blow stuff up, or at least that's a perception, right? And you can make a lot of money doing it. Like people that do this for a living supposedly make a lot of money. I'm not saying any of that's right or wrong. I mean, you know, there are certainly examples and non-examples on both sides of that, but that's the perception. So the interest is there. The problem is with that third bullet there, and that starts getting into something dealing with optimism, and we're going to talk about that and the implications a little bit, but that's sort of where my research is going, is in that vein of trying to increase optimism among these populations, particularly across low socioeconomic, regardless of gender and race. Qualitative data were overwhelmingly positive. So basically, all of the end of course grade score data look great going up. All of our attitudinal stuff is like Starbase isn't doing anything, you know. All these kids are already loving it when they get here, so you're not, you know, this program isn't really changing that much. But when you look at the qualitative data, there's all kinds of value added stuff that pops up. I mean, I'm talking about tons. Anybody that's done much qualitative work, or even I've looked at some of the posters in here and looked at some of the qualitative work in here, you know that when you talk to people or you ask people about a program or interview people in general, people just like to complain about stuff, you know? And you can almost never walk away from a conversation that you have with somebody during one of these interviews where they don't say something negative or complain about something. It's not up here, but we ran a separate part of the study with parents where it was almost 400 parents. Yeah, we were batting 1,000. So it got down to the last week, and we ended up having 3 parents out of the 400 say something negative about the program. And even that wasn't really a strong negative. It was like something that a politician could probably spin to a positive. I mean, it was unbelievable. I have never seen anything like that in any program I've ever worked on before, and I'm including everything that I've ever run. You know, my own stuff, which I would love to be able to claim had that kind of support from parents. So it was impressive. Anybody work with 4th, 5th, 6th graders in here? So you know how much they love to write. Almost 3/4 of those participants, and I showed you that earlier, right? Almost 3/4 of the participants provided a unique positive response to the last open-ended item, which was not a forced item. So in other words, they volunteered to write extra stuff about this program, and it was positive. I was amazed at that too. There were no negative interview responses. Of course, there's selection bias there, but just the same. And then black participants shared an interest in STEM careers, but did not provide specific examples of those careers, as many specific examples as compared to the white students. And all participants reported a lower rate of agreement that they will get those jobs. I go back to the fact that low SES was almost 100%. Free and reduced lunch was like through the roof. I think I know in many of the schools it was 100%. The major project focus were the things that they did. So, it wasn't just that there was one cool teacher. They actually participated in the stuff and knew what they were doing. They wanted more activities, although, the parents said they wanted it during the summer. The kids, not so much. They just wanted to get out of their homeschool more. But basically, the study provides empirical support that STEM-based programs don't necessarily lower literacy and math scores. It introduces a novel structure to address STEM education, one that's both public and private partnership kind of thing, but that doesn't supplant public funds or try to create a charter school system, which devastate many rural school systems in places like Eastern North Carolina. And it provides further supporting evidence that black students, while expressing interest in STEM careers, are not as optimistic as whites that they will get a job in the field. And that also goes for the lower SES, regardless of gender and race. So like I say, for me, that's an area that I'm super interested in right now, and trying to enhance optimism among underrepresented populations that they can, in fact, get these jobs, so that they don't see their STEM instruction as being, irrelevant to their future. And so, me, my contact, the guy that runs it's Rear Admiral Bill Hayden. He goes by his call sign T-Ball, and so he's around. He's working pretty hard. So if you have any questions about that program, he loves to talk about it. Super nice guy. Excellent. Any questions?
3 minutes for questions or comments or suggestions?
Sure, I'll take it all.
Dan, what was the basis for the semantic analysis? Was it interview or?
No, it was a paper pencil. Well, it was a paper pencil test that was converted to an online test. So it was a Likert scale, and they had I'm blanking right now, but a bubble to click. I forget what that's called, but whatever, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
They got a little bubble to click, and that's how they ran it. Yes.
So you said that one of the things you noticed in the STAR-based program is the lack-white achievement gap diminished over time?
Well, in that school system, so we can't attribute that gap closing to any particular part. We don't know what caused it, but in that school system, yes.
Did you take the same data for the control schools?
Yes, and that's what we mean. Compared to the other control schools, there was a significant difference in the black-white achievement gap. Yeah.
And one other question. You
Well,
said-
wait a minute, let me back up there. I do not know that. I need to go back and read the paper.
Okay.
I cannot remember if we ran those analyses or not, because what we wanted to show, one of the things that popped up in that school system was that gap closed, and that was a huge consideration for upper administration in that school system. They simply wanted to know that the trend going up wasn't due to the subgroup pulling up. They had a huge push on black-white achievement gap closure, and so we wanted to demonstrate to them, or at least provide them some data, one way or the other, on whether or not that was happening in their school system. But you're across the hall from me. I'll figure it out.
Sounds good.
Dan, what kinds of, or what types of scores did you use in the different counties to compare the control group?
it was the state publicly available scores. And, you know, due to IRB and all that sort of stuff and being able to drill down, we had to use the data that you typically get from the state.
So you just compared one county to the county that you were actually.
We did it by school, so we were able to go in and get it by school, but that was the level of scoring that we were able to achieve. We weren't able to get down to the individual student or even individual teacher score because of the way that they collect the data and then strip it. Without going through insane amounts of IRB work and, you know, giving blood samples and everything else, that was what we could pull off.
Thank you.
Okay, then, let's give them a round of applause again, everybody.
I'm David Siegel, and I have the pleasure of introducing our next presenter, my colleague, Matt Militello. Matt is the Wells Fargo Distinguished Professor in the Department of Ed Leadership, where I also reside. Before coming to ECU in 2014, Matt held faculty positions at NC State and UMass Amherst, and prior to his academic career, Matt was a middle and high school teacher, assistant principal, and principal in the great state of Michigan. His research focuses on building leadership capacity through the ecologies of self, organization, and community. He has more than 50 publications and has co-authored 5 books. And his book titles are displayed here on the slide behind me. The most recent of which is Reframing Community Partnerships in Education, Uniting the Power of Place and Wisdom of People, out just this year from Routledge. Matt is also currently leading 2 major projects at ECU. In June of 2016, he'll launch a new international EDD that will be online with face-to-face sessions in Bangkok. And he also created an annual summer learning exchange for local and national school and community leaders. Matt has received research funding from the College Board, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Xi'an Normal University in China, and a multi-million-dollar Race to the Top grant to train school leaders in Northeast North Carolina. He is also an evaluator for various National Science Foundation and U.S. Department of Education grants. All this is quite impressive, but long before he was a distinguished scholar, he was the guy you see here in this photo. A distinguished and diehard University of Michigan fan, which he remains to this day. Go Blue. And so it's my pleasure. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Matt Militello.
Thank you.
Yeah, after a bio like that, you have to kind of bring the ego back down to earth. And that is circa 1990. That's the front page when the University of Michigan was #1. We played a game against Michigan State, who I hated at the time. I ended up getting my PhD from Michigan State. But there was a pass interference, so it wasn't called when we lost the game. So I'm just going to own it. I'll put it on the slide, the next slide as well. You know, we're talking about community anyway. We're talking about school leadership and building community. And we've lost the sense of community. When you are in a stadium with 112,000 people, there's definitely a sense of community. It reminds me now of a book that Putnam, a professor at Harvard, wrote recently, not recently, it's about 15 years old now, called Bowling Alone, about how we've become a society of individuals now. That bowling used to be a community event where people used to go and laugh and talk and make policy. And now, if you go to bowling alleys, it's a kind of a pastime. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this research paper that I submitted. I'll probably be talking about a different research paper I can make available to you as well. It's really around the same methodology. But I really like to flip the script. Not only, I think that the main theme I want you to hear today is that I really am going to indict researchers. Because I really think that we don't necessarily address the right kinds of things in our research, and we don't actually talk to the right kinds of people in our research. And the two things that I really hold near and dear to all the work that I do are these 2 statements here. And this is not new. This is, if you read any critical theory, if you're reading Paulo Freire, you know that we should be working in a way that we work with people, not for people. Working for people is something for missionaries, is something for people that want to change other people. But if you want to change anybody, there's two things that need to happen. One, you have to understand their context, and two, you have to have them generate the solutions themselves. So when we're looking for problem solutions, we shouldn't be swooping in, bringing them with us. We should be doing a lot of listening. And so that's really one of my major critiques on that. And I want to show you a demonstration of that, my volume's working here, of what it means to flip the script, that if you take away the voice of the actual people and put someone else's narrative on it, for example, a researcher's narrative that goes back to their office and tries to, regurgitate the things that they found out from the field, it can be very dangerous. How many people are in this room, and there's a lot of young faces here, are familiar with the film The Shining? No hands on. All right, so it's like the Stanley Kubrick, premier psychological horror film, right? About this writer, a lot of us write in this room, we have writer's block. He goes in, he's going to be a caretaker to this mansion, hotel, Overlook Hotel, I think it's called, something bizarre. And he goes batshit crazy. He said, I didn't sign the consent. I'm from the Midwest, we swear a lot. And it's psychological things. But what happens if you actually take the same teaser that was the commercial on TV and add a different narration to it and add some Peter Gabriel music to it?
Meet Jack Torrance.
I'm outlining a new writing project.
He's a writer looking for inspiration.
Lots of ideas. No good ones.
Meet Danny. He's a kid looking for a dad.
There's hardly anybody to play with around here.
Jack just can't finish his book.
I don't want to sound melodramatic, but there's no way to make it economically feasible.
Here's to 5 miserable months. But now, sometimes, what we need the most is just around the corner.
I'm your foster daughter. I'd do anything. Climbing up on Salisbury Hill, I could see the city light. My heart going boom, boom, boom. Son, he said, write the things I've come to take you home.
Now, if you're going to watch that movie clip and go to the movie, you're going to be in a big surprise because the movie is very
Where
different.
can we find that clip?
I can do the website to it, yeah, for sure. I got a couple of them like that. But The Shining one's always. And by the way, if you want to watch a really good documentary, there's one called Room 237. That's about the making of the film. It's really, really cool. All right, so the aims for this short talk are to proselytize Q methodology. I use Q methodology as a research methodology. It's highly marginalized in the field, but I believe it brings voice to the marginalized. It's most prominent in the uses that we and my colleagues use it are actually with youth and in indigenous communities around the country and around the world. But you're also going to be introduced to something called inquiry, which is a new methodology that we created based off of Q methodology. So we're expanding the work of Q methodology into this work called inquiry. And the paper that I submitted actually is mostly based on Q methodology. I actually just have a paper published this week. I brought up a few copies of it. That's really kind of, I think, a seminal piece about this research methodology called inquiry. So I want to hype that and to have more students use it. I just had 2 students defend dissertations here at ECU, both using Q methodology, actually using inquiry. I got to get used to that as a research methodology. And I'll talk a little bit about lessons from inquiry from and for research. So the paper that I submitted is actually around the Carnegie Project on Educational Doctorate. It's really boring stuff. Sorry, Martin. It really is. But essentially, in the professional field, professional field of educational leadership, we have something called the EDD. It's a doctorate, right? And it's really around having a doctorate for educational leaders. Like I was going back to college, I thought I wanted to be a superintendent. I was at a school that had a PhD program, but I would have just as well went to one that had an EDD program. I didn't really care. But we've really meshed the two. People don't know the difference between an EDD and a PhD anymore. And this Carnegie project, which Martin and I are both involved with, really wants to distinguish the two. To make the EDD more a practical degree for educational leaders that want to stay in the field and not become kind of talking heads like me. I didn't know I was going to do this, by the way. I kind of fell ass backwards into this. I was going to be the superintendent. So there's 6 principles I'm definitely not going to read to you around this, but I wanted you to focus on one of the principles, so it's near and dear to my heart, and it's really about providing candidates that are going through these programs opportunities to work with community. And so when they named research fellows for this project, I globbed onto this one because I want to do some research about what institutions that are CPED institutions like ECU are doing about work in the community. Because I hear a lot of talk about people doing work in the community. I don't see a lot of walking around it. Just like we were having that conversation about there's a lot of professors that have the word social justice and equity all over their syllabi, but I don't see them actually doing a lot with that work. So I worked with a colleague, Dr. Anne Marie Fitzgerald from Duquesne University, who heard about Q methodology, really wanted to learn about it. She's a junior faculty member, so I wanted to mentor her through, and that goes back to me proselytizing about Q. And so we did a study around this principle. And so the principle number 3, which you just had up on the screen, talks about how we actually work in community. And so I'm going to walk you through an inquiry process, the Q methodology process, with this question in mind, asking people's perceptions about how this principle is actually lived in their school, in their college. So we had a problem of, we needed to measure perceptions. That's problematic, actually finding out how people think about things. We needed to ask who are we going to ask. It's unit of analysis, as you know, students, is really important. And we didn't want to treat the community like data plantations. That's harsh words, but we often do that. We go and extract data from places without giving anything back, except for a talk, nor do we engage with them. So, Q methodology. What is Q methodology? It's a way to quantify human subjectivity. How you all feel about any given subject in here. If I say, how do you feel about this slide and the colors up on the slide, you're going to all have different opinions about it. But how do we quantify those opinions? How can we actually quantify the different distinct viewpoints that can be actually extracted from this? So it's really a way to quantify people's subjectivity. And we know that it's important because perceptions matter. You know, not just because Da Vinci said all knowledge comes from perceptions, but we know what people think, what their dispositions are, leads to how they act. So the perceptions are really important. I got drawn to Q methodology because of its close proximity to participants. It's not a survey asking people to fill something out, that data plantation, or just going and talking to people and asking them. I was trained as a qualitative researcher where you sit there and listen and nod and write a bunch of notes and you walk away. And it's really different from traditional R methodology, which looks at variables and tries to give a mean score or an aggregate score on a variable. Q methodology flips it, and if you actually use SPSS or SAS, it actually moves, it tilts the axis. So we're actually, the variables are the people that sort. You hear this word sort, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that in a second. But I think it's really important to understand that I think surveys are really important and have a really specific, unique place. That's a euphemism, a really long one. But it tends to vary the meaning in the aggregate score. You really don't know what a 3.2 means when someone puts on a Likert scale and it averages out to 3.2 on a 5-point scale, right? So this tries to really get at that. So the purpose of Q methodology is to extract distinct viewpoints. So walking through an example is going to be really helpful. If you want to learn a little bit more about Q methodology, I would suggest this article here by Steve Brown. Steve writes a lot about how on Easter Island, these big heads here for years have been studied, and studied by people in all kinds of domains, right? And trying to figure out how did they carve these, first of all, and then when they carve them in the middle of the island, how did they move them to the edge of the island? And there are scientific studies out there as recently as 1950 that say things like UFOs must have placed them there, right? And it wasn't until some anthropologists came that said, you know what we should do? We should talk to the elders on the island. You know what the elders said? Oh yeah, we can tell you how they move those things. You rock them back and forth like a refrigerator, you put these sticks underneath, you put these logs over here, and you roll them. People forgot for years just to ask the elders that carry the wisdom and the stories of the place to understand. And that's really the focus of that article around Q methodology. All right, Q methodology step by step. I know I'm talking fast, so I don't have a lot of time. And this is actually multiple courses here I'm trying to cram into one. So it starts with developing a Q sample. You need to have a subject matter, something for people to sort. All right? And this is really comes out of communication theory, concourse theory. In which case, in the case of the example that I'm using with CPED, we started to do a lit review and surveys and asking people questions around what should community engagement look like for doc students in an EDD program. And so the theory is to try to capture all the elements, all the concourse, all the conversation, put it in other terms, around a given topic. And as you can well imagine, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of statements. And then from those number of statements, you have to cull it down. There's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of outliers that you want to keep, because outliers are actually really important to keep. I once did a study on collective leadership, and we had 39 statements. And one of the statements talked about honoring Mother Earth. No other statement had anything like that on it. It was an outlier, and I decided to keep it in the study. And what I found when we did the factor extraction from that is that it became a very positive, high-ranked statement for one group: women, indigenous folks in Hawaii. And had I not put that in the study, the term collective leadership would continue to be driven by dudes that look like David, white men. No offense, you made fun of me. I gotta point out a little bit, right? Because that is the literature. And so withholding something that was so distinct and so unique in the study can really pay some real dividends for understanding. You have to select your participants to do the sort once you have the number of statements. Typically in Q methodology, the statements range from 30 to 50 statements. Typically the P sample, 30 to 40 is fine. You get your power in the study from the number of statements. Right? Standard error from the number of statements, not from the number of people, so you don't generate any power from getting the number of people. 1 over the square root of n being the number of statements. You actually do the data collection, the Q sort, do some data analysis, and this is where it gets a little funky. So that's Q methodology in 4 steps. Develop a Q sample, set of statements, have people sort the statements, and then do factor analysis on the statements. What is extracted are unique, distinct viewpoints. What we've added is this process called inquiry, where we go back to the participants that factored on each of the factors. We change the name from factors to families, we put them in groups together, and we ask them to analyze their own data. That is, you name the factor. Because why should I be so privileged to be able to take your data, go back to my office, and name what you represent? Okay? And I'll show you an example of that. So in the concourse theory, in the study that we did for the CPED, generated 39 statements. And here's some examples. Students engage in service learning activities. Students collaborate with school and community members on analyzing data to identify strengths and weaknesses. Students advocate with community partners. What we've asked people to do that sorted this is to look through all the statements and to make some decisions about which ones they believe are the most important. So who sorted for this study? We had 12 faculty members in College of Education's and educational leadership programs, 3 deans from College of Education, and 13 current EDD students that were actually going through a program, an EDD program in educational leadership. So what do you have them do? You have them sort the statements in a forced distribution. It doesn't matter what it looks like. If it looks kind of like an upside distribution, if that makes you happy, that's great. If you're type A and you need to have it perfect on all sides, go for it. But there's really no magic behind it. But you do want to have people make choices, difficult choices. So of all the statements in the 39 statements, the 2 statements they believe in the most have to go in the +4 category. The 2 statements that they might like and believe in, but just believe in them less, go in the -4. So you make your distinctions, all right? And when you craft your Q statements, they're all pretty tough. There's usually not a no-brainer like, oh, that's easy to put over here. And the best way to collect it is live in person. You can actually talk to the people, it's like doing a live survey, and when they get frustrated and start swearing and muttering under their breath, you can ask them, what card do you have in your hand and why is it making you so upset? That's data that you collect during this process. So that's what the distribution looked like in this study. In this study, we had people do the study by hand, so we could record actual conversations with them as they did it. This is really the pure way to do Q methodology. There's something visceral about moving these cards around. You guys notice the cocktails on the table up there? That was Q sorting in Hawaii. Here in Hawaii, you have to have cocktails. But we also use a Flash Q program so you can do it online. So some of the students that are trying to have people sort them from a distance, you can actually do it online. It's kind of like doing a solitaire game where you can move the statements around. So the data analysis is, the technique is to do factor analysis, and then we use Varimax to rotate. You can do centroid rotation as well. But the key here is to extract unique viewpoints. And on a table here, you can see in this study here, there are very unique viewpoints. If you look at the correlations among the factors, they're not very high at all. So what was extracted here is 3 different viewpoints that are different from one another. That is, the people that sorted in this study think very specifically in 3 different groups, 3 different piles, about those 39 statements. 27 of the people were represented on the 3-factor solution, account for 36% of the variance. A couple of interesting facts. So you can see factor A, B, and C. If you go down, you can see the X next to people's names. Person 6, faculty 5, had an X next to the name. That means they correlated with factor A. Everybody with an X down factor A, they're a factor A person. X is here, factor B. This is the student here I said did not correlate with any of them. What does that mean? That means the way that student sorted the statements was different than everybody else. It's not good, it's not bad. It's just for the purpose you have to make decisions when you do research, and so they're extracted. We took them out of the study. They're not accounted for in this study. Another interesting aspect is if you see here, I said there's 3 factors, but there's 4 families. Where the heck did I get 4 families from? If you look down here on factor C, you see these X's. Those folks up here represent factor C. Down here, these 3 folks have a negative in front of their number. What does that mean? That means that they're statistically significant on that factor, but in a mirror image. If you physically put a mirror up to that sort, they would come up to it and say, that's my sort. That's my sort. So what we actually have here are 4 families. And what does that mean? So the next step is to do this inquiry process. So when we work with folks, we need multiple days because you have to crunch the numbers and you bring people back a day or 2 later. They would walk into a room like this. There would be 4 tables set up, and you get a name tag, and David's name tag would say A, he would go to table A. Table A would have person 4, person 6, 10, all these folks would be sitting with David at his table. And so there would be 4 tables, because remember this is going to be 1 table by itself here. An interesting note here that's not statistically significant, was kind of good roadside kill, kind of gawky and stuff. Look at the 3 deans. They're all in the same one. It was the most traditional of factors.
The indoctrination process.
Yes. Very fascinating. Now we don't have this is where Q methodology is not as strong as R because we can't do correlations here and do a chi-square to find out if there's some real power in that. But rubbernecking data would indicate maybe so. So David goes to table A. How does he spread his cards out on the table with his group? He gets this table here. He takes statement 1 and puts it in the -1 column. He takes statement 2, puts it in the 1. Put statement 3 into 3, spreads those cards back out. David and the folks that had the X's next to their name on factor A would look at that and say, pretty much like mine. Some more than others. Some were correlated at 0.7, and some down to a 0.5. But nonetheless, they would agree. They would say, that reflects my viewpoint. And we would have them have a conversation about that. You can see here what we did with D. Basically, we took the opposite, the mirror image. So those 3 folks that were the statistically significant, but in a negative way to C, sat at their own table. And we put them through a protocol. And we asked them to interrogate the data at the table. Why did you sort like this? Look at the cards of the +3 and +4. Why did you put them there? Look at the cards down here. Which cards did you have most difficult placing? And most importantly, we give them poster paper and or a t-shirt and ask them to represent with a slogan or an image the name of the factor. Something we can't do, we shouldn't be doing, we shouldn't be that privileged to do without their input. I'm going to look at factor B because factor B was the most interesting to me. Like I said, the factor A had all the deans on it, but it was kind of old school thought about how we should or shouldn't be doing things. This factor here really represented, it was 5 faculty members and 4 students. This was with their sort, so all those 9 people walked up to that table and saw those statements there and said, yeah, that's generally my sort. Some of the statements they had at the high end, those +4s and +3, were probably the statements that were a little bit more cutting edge about how we would think about doing community work in a different way to really facilitate working with community members as opposed to for them in interacting with multiple stakeholders. So if you read the paper, you can dig into it. It's really a boring paper, but I'm more fascinated with the methodology today to talk to you about that. The last thing that Q methodology allows us to do is do consensus statements. So there are three, in this study, there were three statistically significant consensus statements, which basically means no matter who sorted those folks that were in the study, they generally put them in the same place. And those are fascinating to look at. In this study, for example, statement number 18, students present with scholars and community partners, was pretty much universally rejected by everybody. Is that for them, their perceptions of what really means to be an engaged scholar in community really didn't matter as much as the other things. Again, it's not good or bad. Among all these difficult choices they made, that's where most people in the study put it. The statement 10 and 32 are kind of buried in the middle, but universally buried in the middle. So no matter who actually sorted the statements. So what I think that the inquiry aspect does, that we write about in this paper, is it does a number of things. It provides a new normative language. By the very act of having one set of statements around a given topic, you generate normative statements, a normative language around something. We've been actually doing this in some consulting work with universities and businesses that want some normative language about strategic planning and understanding, and we found that this process, the exact same process I walked you through, from development of statements, to the sorting, to the analysis, to the inquiry process where we have folks sitting together, is part of that development. It empowers voice. You get this reflective piece, both, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, both individual and collective, and more important, application. Because when we work with folks, oftentimes it shouldn't stop at collecting data and even asking them to help us understand the data, but what are you going to do with the data now that you know what you know? How do you move forward with it? And so, if you look at research as critical consciousness, which I really encourage you all to do, you can start thinking about, David in my introduction talked about, I investigate a lot of the work around the colleges of self-organization and community. When I teach leadership courses, it's a whole semester about self. I don't think you can help anybody else until you fully interrogate and understand who you are as an educator, as a person, and how you can actually bring that work with you and move forward into that context. We talk about the organization and how no matter how strong you are, you know this, and you know this especially and we know this as students, that you build all this knowledge and you become really strong in different areas and content knowledge, and you get into an organization and they chew you up. Chew you up. The organization always wins. So how do we combat that? How do we fight back? And the most important element, of course, is community. I believe that this inquiry process gets at the issues of ontology, of how we understand a way of being, your understanding of the world, your epistemology, and actually the axiology of how the world should be and how it might be. How we can actually, if you interrogate a set of statements around something that's near and dear to you, and you're working with folks that are working with you in that area, not only do you come to understand where you all are in the process and where you all sit in the perceptions, but you can actually, once that happens, start moving forward to understand what you want to do next with your work. So I wanted to show you a couple of examples of the work we do with the inquiry. This is an actual t-shirt. This is a work that we did in Seattle, where we had a multiple day project on this inquiry work, and we were able to give folks actual t-shirts and fabric paint, and their groups actually created, and were able to hang out and display and talk about what their factor, which of course we changed the name to family, what their family represented. And then they worked on action plans together. Oftentimes, when we bring people together to do this work, they're in a family, but they're not in their home team. They're not with their team that came there. So we actually provide teams for them to go back to their home team, and then they get to interact in different way. Like, oh, I saw you were in Factor B. No wonder. Now I understand a lot more about you. This is a picture of folks working around, huddling around the common sort to understand it. And this is using just paper and pencil and colored markers and things. I think the important thing to point out here is the language. There's no way if I went back to my office and looked at that factor, I would be able to come up with that language to name that factor. Because that's not my language, and nor should it be. So in closing, I want to say that I think the inquiry process really empowers and privileges the participants at the beginning, the middle, the end, and the reflective cycle of the process. And I think that's really important when we start thinking about how to engage with participants as researchers, is how we engage with them throughout the process. So my email's here. If you want more information about inquiry, I do, so this is the article that just came out, it's hot off the presses, and I photocopied 5 PDFs. If you're interested, come and grab me, I can give you one. And if you want to see a 6-minute or so video on the overview of the inquiry process, this is the website that you can watch a short video on. So, talk real fast, sorry.
Okay, we have about a minute for questions or comments or suggestions. I'm kind of curious.
So why quantify it?
Why quantify it?
Yeah, because it sounds like a methodology, and so I'm clearly with a lot of more steps in practice. So I'm curious about this, the privileging of voices, but then turning those voices into sort of numbers, and like, why quantify it? Why not just have it be a more qualitative process that's not a methodological process that has member checks and validity built in?
Yeah, I think that if you do qualitative research in the most pristine way, you can probably accomplish the same kinds of
Like a
things.
participatory action research or a critical YPAR or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm trained as a qualitative researcher. That's what I've done, and I just have never come across a methodology that engages participants in a way that this does. I can tell you time and time again, after we leave, people say things, I need those cards, I gotta take them with me, I need to engage in this process. I think it's, in some ways, it's a crutch, it's kind of an artificial way to generate those conversations people need to have. But the beautiful part about it is in a quick amount of time, you can put people in affinity groups, right? And affinity is based on their perceptions, not on ethnic, gender, or other things. So it's a quick way to engage in the conversations. I would contend that the most important part is by far is the qualitative aspects of it, but it's a way to get to that.
Just to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, I think pure qualitative research can lose voices as well. Because it boils down when we're getting our themes and these sorts of things, you can leave things out. This doesn't seem to do that. And then you also had the neat interaction between participants where they were going, oh, wow, you did it that way. I hadn't thought about that, and then they're going to go back and work together. So I like that aspect. And now we are putting numbers to it, really, they're ranking.
I mean, I think we should do that as a college. I think a faculty of college education should do a CUSA around, what our mission is. It'd be really fascinating, and it would be a nice way for people to get to know each other because they hold some similar viewpoints, but also differences across tables. It's never contentious.
How did you come up with the statements? Just jumping in there.
Yeah, so the statements, it's highly qualitative. It's tough. So usually if we were doing a study like we did here with the CPET around community engagement, do a lit review. So that's for the students, they have to do a lit review anyway. So what they do is they do a traditional literature review and they create a table for me that has just all statements they extract from the literature. Unique statements have to have one thing. They have no conjunctions in them, not double meaning. It's got to have one thing, and then they code it. And then I ask them to interview a handful of people around in the field to get more statements. So then, just in the defense last week, some of the community members were saying, how did you come up with statement 19? They were able to say, look at table 4.2. It says statement 19, and it was extracted from these 3 pieces of literature and these 2 interviews. And I combine the statements to come to that one. But it's okay to have the outlier, like I said, to have some that has just 1 citation on it as well.
All right, let's give them a hand, everybody. We're moving to our roundtable. So roundtable presenters, I hope you are in position. And our students, if you would go to your posters, share information.